Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into something pretty profound from our source material. We're looking at the idea that our absolute deepest drive as human beings is the need for connection, the need for unity. If you've ever found yourself wondering, why we form communities, why being isolated hurts so much, or even where certain mental health struggles actually come from, well, you're in the right place. We're going to break down how human cooperation isn't just nice to have, it's the literal foundation of our entire existence.
Let's jump right into this concept. Our source frames cooperation not as some lofty moral ideal, but as a total psychological necessity for survival. The text makes a really compelling case that without a genuine interest in our fellow human beings, our basic capabilities literally cannot develop. Even language itself only exists because we need to bond. So, think about this. What if the secret to overcoming our very deepest struggles is directly tied to how we relate to the people around us?
Section 1. The striving for unity. When we zoom out and look at the grand sweep of human history, it becomes super clear that this drive to connect is an ancient, deeply primitive mechanism. It's actually the oldest striving we have. From day one, humanity has constantly built systems to force us to cooperate and survive against the elements. It literally started with primitive totems. Groups would worship a lizard or a bull, bringing them together to share harvest tips and fend off wild animals. Then, early marriage customs evolved, forcing individuals to seek partners outside their immediate little bubble, which expanded those social bonds. Later on, religions popped up with universal rules like love thy neighbor. And finally, even modern political and social movements share this exact same DNA. The end goal has always been societal betterment and a higher degree of cooperation.
Section 2. The trap of self-interest.
So if unity is our natural evolutionary endgame, what happens when someone just turns completely inward? There is a really stark, actually quite dangerous contrast between living with a shared understanding of the world and retreating into total self-interest. See, social interest is all about submitting to the common experience of humanity. Understanding relies on sharing. But self-interest? That is the greatest conceivable obstacle to progress. When people start seeking personal superiority above everything else, they retreat into what our source calls a private meaning of life. They build a reality that absolutely no one else can understand, let alone share.
And here's the crucial point. Lacking social interest isn't just about being a little selfish. It manifests in wild, seemingly totally unconnected ways. Sometimes it looks like mild neuroses, like compulsive blushing or stammering, which deep down reveal this intense inability to comfortably bond with others. Or it could look like a vacant hangdog expression on a child who just refuses to make eye contact. But, and this is where it gets scary, it can also manifest as severe criminal negligence. Think of a worker carelessly leaving a cable stretched across a busy road, or someone accidentally starting a massive forest fire just by tossing a match, simply because they were literally never trained to think about the safety of anyone but themselves.
Section 3. Isolation and mental illness.
Let's zoom in even closer on the individual. We're going to examine the absolute most extreme form of this isolation, which is severe mental illness. Our source material argues that conditions like schizophrenia actually denote a complete remoteness from society. It's a total, fundamental failure to relate to fellow human beings. But the really key takeaway here is this. The text argues that even this extreme level of isolation isn't necessarily incurable, not if the sufferer's interest in other people can somehow, against all odds, be reawakened.
To show you what I mean, consider this incredible clinical story from the text. A doctor was brought in to treat a schizophrenic girl. She was in a state where she actually barked like a dog and spat at people, because she felt her own mother had treated her like a dog. Look at the steps he took to bring her back. Step 1 was absolute patience. He sat and spoke to her for 30 days straight before she finally gave a confused reply. Step 2, non-resistance. As she started getting her courage back, she tested him. She literally hit him, but he didn't retaliate. He didn't have her locked up, he just looked at her kindly, completely depriving her of an enemy. And step 3 was unconditional support. When she lashed out, broke a window, and cut her hand, he didn't scold her, he just quietly bandaged it. By consistently offering this friendly, unconditional presence, he pulled her back into society. A year later, she was completely healthy and holding down a job.
That story brilliantly illustrates extreme self-interest in mental isolation. And it usually takes two sides. On one side, you've got paranoia, where the patient openly and aggressively accuses all of humanity of conspiring against them. But on the other side, there's melancholia. Now, melancholics might appear to be accusing themselves, saying things like, oh, I've ruined my family, I'm a burden. But our source notes something fascinating. This is actually a disguised attack. It is a long, simmering rage used to secretly manipulate others, demanding care, sympathy, and support through weaponized self-pity.
So how do you treat that? Well, to treat melancholia, one doctor used a radically counterintuitive first rule. He told his patients point blank, never do anything you don't like. Seriously, if you want to stay in bed all day long, do it. Now, why on earth would this work? Because he completely removed the patient's ability to play the victim. By giving them absolute blanket permission to act like gods and do whatever they pleased, he entirely diffused their secret need to dominate and accuse everyone else. Think about it. If everyone simply agrees with you, there's literally no one left to fight. Once he broke through that initial resistance, he would challenge these deeply self-absorbed patients with what he called the 14-day cure. The prescription was super simple, but for them, incredibly difficult. He told them, spend your sleepless nights figuring out how you can please someone else. It's brilliant. It ingeniously, forcibly redirected their focus completely away from their own private meaning and shoved it right back toward the society they had been isolating themselves from.
Section 4. Rebuilding the human bond.
Zooming back out from those intense clinical cases, we really have to ask the big question. How do we prevent this tragic isolation in the first place? How do we build that human bond early on? Well, the text explains that while the raw potential for social feeling is inherited by every single one of us, it is definitely not a guaranteed instinct. It's basically like a muscle, and that muscle has to be actively developed by our environment, starting from the exact moment we're born. If children feel like they're surrounded by enemies, well, they prepare for war. If they're entirely focused on their own little physical irritations, they just shut themselves off from the world entirely.
So, how do we train that muscle? It mostly happens in two primary environments: the family and the school. In the family, parents absolutely must model friendship and value the child equally. That's how a kid learns that trustworthy human beings actually exist out there. Then they go to school, where the child becomes part of a class and has to rely on their peers. The incredible outcome of this really intentional environmental training is a child who feels totally at home in a friendly world, rather than seeing every interaction as a battlefield.
And that brings us to Section 5, creating a cooperative society.
Ultimately, all of that muscle training in our early years is just preparing us for the massive shared project of society itself. We don't learn cooperation just to be polite, right? We learn it so we can survive and thrive together. The source material beautifully distills all our complex societal obligations down to the three great problems of human life. Number 1, work. Being a good work colleague and actually contributing something useful. Number 2, friendship. Being a solid, reliable companion to your fellow humans. And number 3, love. Being a true, equal partner in a relationship. And here's the kicker. We can only conquer these three monumental challenges through genuine, outward-facing cooperation.
So I want to leave you with this final thought from our explainer today. To face life's tasks cooperatively is the absolute highest praise we can possibly earn. It's the ultimate proof that we are true human beings, deeply connected to the past, the present, and the future of humankind. So take a look at your own life for a second. Your work, your friendships, your relationships. How will you take on that responsibility today? Thanks for hanging out and keep striving for that unity.